Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's freezing mom, Clara.
Oh, come on. It was 11 degrees this morning, and I went out. I waited till it warmed up till 12. It was 12 degrees, and I went out, and I did a little walk in the snow in my sandals and shorts and T-shirt. I'm loving it.
I know that, and I was, as you were walking, bundled under 4 blankets with a space heater, with the oil heater on, with the electric heat on, and I was still shivering. So
well, you just have to get out and get conditioned to it.
Right.
Next time I go on a walk, you can come along with me.
Wonderful. I'll sit in the car with the heater on, Jimmy.
That's right.
Oh.
So, we're talking about survivors the last few episodes here. And we talked about triggers last time, and actually we have 2 people that we'll be interviewing who are survivors, and they're going to give us some more insight into triggers and how they work through their triggers, how they have learned to listen to them and listen to what their body is telling them. So I'm pretty honored to be able to talk with those survivors and hear what they have to say. So that'll be coming up soon. But today, along with this series, we want to talk about why does it take survivors so long to tell? And what do we do with that? Those of us on the outside who are not abused, especially when you're in leadership, what do we do when somebody waits, 15, 17, 20 years to tell?
Right.
What do you do with that? So I guess I'll preface this with the recent story, the Wes Feltner story. And he had two of his victims came forward publicly, and they were abused 17 years ago. Both Megan and Joanna came forward very bravely and courageously and powerfully. They told all, and they held nothing back. I read both of their accounts, and I just was really, really impressed with the detail. And I mean, it was documented with pictures, and everything they said was validated in their stories and the way that they told them. And I thought that was really incredible. And the reason they did that is because Wes Feltner, who is really well known in the Southern Baptist Church, in fact, he teaches or was teaching at seminary. And if I remember my facts right, there was a preacher search committee that had been looking at him, and his name was kind of in the ring to transfer to a different church. And these 2 survivors came forward and they said, no, this is what he did to us, and you need to know, because this guy's like super highly respected. So, long story short, he never apologized to his victims. They were both minors, I believe, when he started dating them. He was actually dating them at the same time, and he was dating the 2 of them at the same time that he was dating his girlfriend. All 3 of them went to the church that he was pastoring, and none of them knew about each other until one of his victims was telling a friend, kind of confiding in her. And then the other one was talking to the same woman. She was like, there's something you both need to know. And so that's how they found out that
Now, by dating, Jimmy, just for those who don't know the story.
Yeah, so they were both minors. He was their pastor or youth pastor or something like that, and he had asked the parents for permission, but told them that because of his position as a leader, he had to keep the relationship quiet. Mm-hmm. So I just think at what it took for him to be that brazen, to go and talk to the parents, both of these parents, from both girls, to ask for permission to date them. He's dating them at the same time, and he has a girlfriend. And they knew that he had a girlfriend.
We're not talking just going to watch a movie, are we?
No, well, they were watching movies, but it was over at his apartment. Okay. So he would invite them over, and he would actually alternate nights. So he had certain nights for each of the three girls that he would have over to his apartment. Both of his victims were both Megan and Joanna were under the strong impression that he was breaking up or already had broken up with his girlfriend, and that just wasn't true. Mm-hmm. He was dating her. In fact, he ended up marrying her. Mm-hmm. So it's just a really tragic story, and so many layers of abuse and lying and deception and taking advantage of them sexually. And they were pretty graphic in their, well, not graphic, but pretty honest in their descriptions of what happened when they were abused. And I mean, he was having full-on intercourse with them. And, this guy was so loved by the church and so respected. And
at that age, girls are so vulnerable.
Oh, yeah.
They fall in love so easily. And to some people, they might go, oh, hogwash, that's silly. It's not.
No, it's very true.
It is very true. And to think of when we don't want to gloss over the fact that they were being lied to, deceived. That's a horrible thing.
Yeah, and he swooned them. I mean, he took one of them, I think it was Megan, that he took to Las Vegas on a trip.
Right. And under the premise of having the blessing of their parents, too.
Which was all part of the deception.
Right.
It's awful. I've
known girls who really have become suicidal after something like that. They have been, and it's not uncommon for that to happen.
Well, because they thought they were genuinely in love with him.
Right.
And thought that he was in love with them. And he wasn't that much older. He was in his 20s, but I don't remember exactly how much older he was. But, that's besides the point.
It's the whole thing in that position of youth pastor, trusted position, man of God, talked to my parents, got the okay, this must be all right, it must be all good. And then, to find out there's not one, but two, not two, but three. It's horrific.
Yeah.
It is. Terrible.
Well, he issued I don't want to say apology because that's not what it was. He issued a statement to his church, and most survivors that I saw who were reposting it or talking about it said they couldn't even listen to the whole thing because it was so triggering. And, I listened to most of it, and then I just had to turn it off, not because it was triggering for me, but because it just was total BS. It was so abusive towards both Megan and Joanna. And he said, I had the consent of their parents. I had their blessing. And, they're making up all these lies, and they're making up all this information. And he was, took absolutely zero responsibility and blamed it all on them. He's not a good person.
Well, I was going to say there's no remorse, there's no sorrow.
There's no admission that he did anything wrong.
Right, no admission of any wrongdoing. And then you have left these young ladies broken in the tail of things. And that happens so much. And I guess the question that I was talking to you about is is it right? Is it good? Is it okay? When a person that's been abused, say 20, 25 years ago, 17 years ago, as in this case, to bring the abuse out in the open at that point, and because obviously it's going to make news, whether it's headlines across the nation or family news or church news, whatever, it is going to cause some ripples in both sides of
well,
our
I think,
lives.
yeah, I mean, to answer the question, and I know it's a rhetorical question, but absolutely, it's okay, it's good, and it's right to tell, whether it's
And I think
5 minutes or 5 decades
right.
after the abuse happened.
I think that those who have been abused need to have that reinforced.
Yeah. I mean, whenever they're
right.
ready to tell, whenever they've processed, whenever they feel courageous enough, when they feel supported enough, by all means, they should tell someone. And I think, I mean, the trend that we see is that survivors who come forward years after the fact are almost always fully supported by the advocacy community and almost always fully shunned by the religious community.
Now, why do you think that is? And I've seen it also. I've been watching this.
I think it's because of all the bad theologies and bad practices and bad hearts that have been stored up within the religious community. And, the most common response is, well, if this really was that bad, why did you wait 17 years to tell? If this has bothered you as bad as you say that it has bothered you, where you're suicidal and you're depressed and you're on medication and you're seeing a therapist and you have all these trauma responses. If things were really that bad, why didn't you speak up sooner? That's a common response. That's probably the most common response. And that's just, I'd like to think that part of that is ignorance and people are just uninformed, and then it goes back to common sense. I was asked that question this last weekend. I spoke remotely for a seminary that was doing a seminar on abuse. And somebody asked me that question. How did you know to believe your sister? And how did you know to respond the way that you and your mom responded? And I said, I don't want this to sound arrogant in any way because that's not how it's meant, but it was common sense.
Absolutely.
I mean, did you and did we for 1 minute sit and talk about a plan and
never?
Oh my goodness, what do we do? We didn't. No. We saw a broken person in front of us, and common sense tells you to believe that when somebody is broken down, and especially with that weighty of a memory that they're recalling, which by the way happened years and years and years ago. She was 21 when she spoke with you and I. And she was, I don't know, around the age of 5 at the height of the abuse. Right. So this was years later. And that was the first time you and I heard about it.
I've also been reading along these lines, Jimmy. A lot of those who have been abused are being questioned, saying, are you sure you're remembering that right? You are sure that's how it happened? Because look at this person. They would never do that to you. You're sure?
And they'll say, even if they did, look at them now.
Right. And I cannot remember in my mind that thought even going through my mind.
I know it didn't go through my mind.
I know it didn't with you. And we need to caution ourselves, everybody, take the person who is abused when they're broken like that, like you said, Jimmy, and they've finally found the courage to speak out. As in the case of these 2 women who this abuse happened 17 years ago, they had everything documented. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Come on. And for this man to make light of it, to gloss over it, to say...
Not only that, he was angry.
And to be angered at... Well,
he was entitled.
Angry. His life is being turned upside down right now. He was, sleeping in a cozy bed. Now it's not so cozy anymore. So,
but I think over and over we see leaders say things like, well, my goodness, that you're expecting us to confront somebody for something that happened 17 years ago. Well,
think about a murder.
Well, think about a murder. I mean, if somebody came and said, "Hey, I have information that I think I know of a homicide that happened 17 years ago, and I have details, like vivid details, that I can give you." Can you imagine an investigator saying, "Quit wasting my time. Why don't you just forgive that person and move on? Why don't you forget about this? This happened 17 years ago and you're bringing it up now." Nobody in their right mind would do that.
Right.
Never mind investigators. People in the church wouldn't do that. But when it comes to abuse, everything changes. And they'll say things like, well, what part did you have in it? You were dating the guy. You even said that you were dating him at the time. So clearly you had some responsibility. Well, no, they didn't.
Right.
They didn't at all, because one, the guy totally manipulated them and their parents into thinking that this was a legitimate relationship. Two, they didn't know that there were not only one, but two other girls that he was dating at the same time. Three, he was their pastor. And they were in the youth group.
That's just so wrong on every level.
Right.
On every level, it's so wrong.
And he was having sex with them.
Right.
It wasn't
just
a a mildly
casual dating,
physical relationship. I mean, he was a hog. And he took so much from them. I mean, when you're deceived and somebody they steal away your innocence, especially at that age, you never get that back.
Nope. It impacts you forever and ever
and
ever.
And he took that from them.
Yes.
So, it's absolutely a proper response to speak up when you've been able to process it and when you feel comfortable to tell. And I just urge church leaders and all these people who hurl these insults and don't even realize that they're doing it, because the one church that he was applying to, now they issued a public apology, but they got up there and they addressed it, and they were like, basically, we don't know where all this animosity is coming from, and they said, we don't have a single person in the church's history who doesn't have some kind of a controversy, because that's sin. We all have sin. So it's that sin leveling, There's no leader here who's blameless, nor is there any member sitting in the pews who's blameless. And that was their approach. And I'm thinking, this is not that. This is not the same thing.
Way different. Right. Yep.
And what he was doing in essence was saying, well, you women come out of nowhere to accuse this guy, and for what? And so we're going to move forward with the process anyway. And that's what the guy said. He's given this announcement, and he said, we're going to move forward with this process anyway. Well, then there was such a public outcry that that same guy issued an apology. I can't remember his name. I should have looked this up, but he issued a public apology and said, we repent, and we didn't realize that our words were so hurtful. So, I commend them for that. But common sense.
Right.
I mean, they should remove themselves from leadership if they don't have that much common sense.
Once again,
just to acknowledge the hurt.
Protection of the one
of Wes Feltner.
Right.
Yeah. He's a good old boy, and
not the focus wasn't on those who got abused, but it was protecting the one that was being called out.
Right.
So it's wrong.
And this wasn't
mixed up.
To make it worse, I think it's worse because this wasn't whisperings or rumors or just stuff floating around. this was two women who wrote very detailed
Mhm.
accounts of what happened to them.
And that tells me something, Jimmy. It tells me that it took time. As they were processing, they documented.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the thought process, the pain?
Oh, I know.
Can you
having to
imagine
relive all of that.
digging that pain
Mhm.
up and mulling through that? And that's part of their, I think people might be saying, well, why did they have to say something now? Why? Well, part of the healing. I don't think it's possible that you can heal when that's still festering inside. That's a
Well, and
pain that has to be released.
And I see, 99% of the time, what I see as survivors who do speak up finally is because they see something of that person where they either suspect or they know that he's doing it to
It's still
other
happening.
women or girls.
Right. Yep. Mhm.
In fact, that's why
Yeah.
Alex came to you and I,
Right.
because she saw him interacting with these girls, and that's what started her memories
That
coming
was
back.
a
She didn't have memories,
major- No, that was a major turning point
Yeah.
for her.
and when those memories started coming back,
Mhm.
she said the thought of him abusing those little girls made me sick to the stomach,
Yeah.
and I had to tell.
Mhm. At
So-
the expense of risking would she be believed.
Mm-hmm.
She knew that her dad was a very public figure in
And
our
she knew that I
community.
had the deepest respect for him.
Yes.
She
that
knew that,
all of the above.
you know?
That had to be horrific for her.
yeah. I think
But-
she probably felt she had more of a chance with you believing her. I would assume. I mean,
Mhm.
I never asked her that, but, and by the way, I always feel like I have to say this. Alex she spoke publicly about this. Heather Sells did, from
Right.
CBN News, did a story back in, I think that published in February. So Alex did come forward by name, and she did talk
Right.
about details of that. So,
Mhm.
we're not exposing somebody by name
No,
who
which we would
wants to
never
remain
do.
anonymous.
Right.
We would
Right.
never, ever
By
do that.
permission only. Right. Yes.
So, I think Alex probably felt she had more of a chance of you believing her because you had already separated from him.
Right.
For me, I'd never had any issues with him,
Mm-hmm.
ever.
Right. Right.
And for her to come and
Isn't
risk
this,
that is courageous.
poor girl, poor you, I should say. My first response as to what we needed to do was we need to share this with Jimmy. I knew you would believe it. I knew you would do the right thing. I knew you would take
Yeah.
us, and I did.
No, that's not poor me. That's just,
Yeah.
I mean-
well, you know how I meant it. You were the chosen one here.
yeah.
But
No, that's
I
okay.
knew your response would be the right one.
Yeah.
I did.
I just don't understand. I mean, I'm trying to wrap my mind around that, and it's not because there's anything special inside of you or I. It's just that
No.
we followed common sense, and common sense also is tied to your intuition. And our intuition tells us that when somebody is bleeding and hurt in front of you, you step in and you take care of them.
You do.
Yes. And we had somebody who was not physically bleeding, but internally,
Oh, her heart. Was
emotionally,
bleeding.
she
Yeah.
was bleeding out.
Mhm.
And it was all over her. It was written all over her. And that's why I can't understand, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for the leaders who their response is, well, my goodness, this happened 17 years
Right.
ago. Why would you bring it
For
up
that
now?
crass coldness. There's just not a compassion.
Or
there.
Chris Conley at High Point, Memphis, when he, after Jules Woodson came forward, which was incredibly painful for her. Incredibly painful. And I think she had no idea the gravity of how far she would be pushed into the public eye. I really don't think she
Of course not. She
understood
she
that
had
at
no
the time.
way of right.
But, whenever she came forward, Chris Conley, with his arm wrapped around Andy Savage, and he's, talk about what a good brother he is. Then he pulls that rock out. He has this rock inside of a box, and like for dramatic effect, he opens it up, and, the Bible says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And I'm like, you're an idiot. That
Couldn't
message
be
clearly
any more far
was
from-
aimed.
Right. Yeah.
He may as well have taken that rock and just chucked
Winged
it at Jules
her.
Woodson.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm.
And, I've talked to Jules about that and what she was thinking when she saw that. It's just, it's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, they're that calloused and mean. And
I think it's time that we, a year and a half ago when we first started our podcast, I was hesitant to say things like that, but I'm not anymore because there's so much information out now as to how you should respond.
yeah, it's
to
not,
those
yeah,
who
it's
have
not
been
like,
abused.
yeah, it's not like there's no information out there. These guys at the church where Wes Feltner was applying or whatever, they have all this information at their fingertips.
Right.
All of us are writing. We
Yeah.
write about it. We blog about it. We're
All the
on
time.
Twitter. We're on
Every
Facebook.
single
We're
day,
everywhere.
the information is being circulated.
And even if they,
yeah.
even if they didn't have any prior knowledge of the advocacy realm, and they don't know who any of the advocates are, and survivor advocates, and if let's just say they had no reason to look up people who are in advocacy prior to this.
Okay, right.
Okay, so these two courageous women write their story. A simple Google search would give you a plethora of information. That wasn't our case 8 years ago.
No, it was.
I mean,
not.
I dug and dug and dug and dug and dug, and I couldn't find
Nope.
hardly anything. Now,
Well, it's
you have
every
all
day
kinds
over,
of incredible resources.
Thankfully, yes.
So, all that to say, yeah, I agree with you 100%. There is no excuse. And so even though it's good that this guy issued an apology, I'm not talking about Wes Feltner. Wes Feltner, I don't think he'll ever issue an apology. But the other guy who was on the preacher search committee, he issued an apology. But, the other point I want to make is that's good, but the damage is already done. And
Right.
you should have searched a little bit. You should have lifted one finger to find out how to care for somebody who has an allegation of this magnitude. Because responding well is vital. Over and over and over, survivors say that the way churches responded to the abuse was worse than the abuse itself.
Well, Jimmy, ultimately, too, I feel that the way churches respond has a direct link to how the abused person feels about God.
And themselves.
And themselves, both. And by that I mean we, meaning people other than you who are in ministry, look to those of you who are in ministry to be our examples. Like it or not, we do. And there's something special, we feel, and the Bible talks about that. You have a special responsibility, a special assignment, so to speak. And when the response is like that, it has a reflection on what that relationship is with God the Father. And it is crushing when that response is not a godly response.
Yeah.
It just is. And it doubles the brokenness.
Yeah.
That's all. It doubles the pain.
Yeah. So, I think survivors just need to know, they need to know that they're going to go through the ringer whenever they speak up. But they also need to know that there's a community of advocates and fellow survivors who will surround you. I mean,
the support is incredible.
I look at the support both of Megan and Joanna, and it's tremendous. I mean, people have been incredibly gracious and kind, and you have people writing blog posts about this who are, they're advocates who are writing blog posts validating both Megan and Joanna, and they have support. They have our support.
Right.
They're incredible ladies. I'm blown away at their power and courage and their strength. So, just be aware there are both sides of that coin, but don't get sucked into that belief that nobody cares, because that's just not true.
Right.
There are those of us who will support you and encourage you, and we'll cheer you on. We'll help you. So it is always worth speaking
I've
up.
often talked about on this podcast the tidal wave that is happening, and that tidal wave of support is really big right now.
Yeah.
And it's big and it's strong, and it will really wash over you and pull you close. So I think our message, part of our message today is don't be afraid to tell your story. If it's been 20 or 25 years ago, you will no doubt experience some backlash, but it won't be from in any way comparable to the support you'll get.
Yeah.
Really and truly.
Well, that sounds like a good truth bomb.
There you go.
So we'll hang it up, leave it there. Thank you
right.
all for tuning in this episode. We'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcast, or Stitcher. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.